I am Calvin. I am 70 years old, and I always believed that a father's greatest legacy was the absolute safety of his family. But 3 days ago, I came home early from a fishing trip and found my empty house smelling of industrial bleach and my wife fighting for her life in the intensive care unit. When I rushed to the hospital expecting to find my son and his wife in tears, I found them sitting comfortably in the waiting area. They were drinking expensive lattes and laughing over a glossy real estate brochure as if nothing had happened. They thought I was just a clueless, tired old man. They thought I would blindly trust them. I walked right out to the hospital stairwell, pulled out my phone, and permanently locked every single financial account they had access to. The absolute panic that set in when their credit cards started declining was just the beginning of my lesson. Before I tell you the rest of this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespect and greed should always be met with severe consequences. The drive back to my home in the quiet suburbs of Seattle was supposed to be relaxing. I had spent the last 4 days at a remote cabin up in the mountains, a trip my wife Patty had practically forced me to take. She told me I needed the fresh air and the quiet. Patty and I had been married for 42 years, and she knew exactly when I needed to step away from the world. We had built a beautiful life together. I spent decades working long, demanding hours as a civil engineer, pouring every ounce of my energy into securing our future and providing a life of privilege for our only son, Colin. I had looked forward to coming home a day early to surprise Patty. I had even stopped at the local market to buy her favorite yellow tulips. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was completely dark. It was mid-afternoon, and usually the curtains would be drawn back to let the natural light flood into the living room. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped inside expecting the familiar scent of Patty baking or the sound of the television playing her favorite afternoon programs. Instead, an unnatural, absolute silence greeted me. But it was not just the silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was the smell. The overwhelming, pungent chemical odor of industrial-strength bleach hung thick in the air. It burned the back of my throat the moment I took a breath. I set the yellow tulips down on the entryway table and called out Patty's name. There was no answer. I walked further into the house and noticed that the hardwood floors leading toward the main staircase were impeccably, completely spotless. They were gleaming wet in certain spots as if someone had just scrubbed them with a manic intensity. Patty never used harsh chemicals like bleach on our antique hardwood. She always said it ruined the finish. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. A deep, primal instinct told me that something was terribly wrong. I walked toward the kitchen and saw the answering machine sitting on the granite counter. The small red light was blinking furiously. I pressed the play button, and the automated mechanical voice of the hospital dispatch filled the empty kitchen. The message stated that Patricia Foster had been admitted to the emergency room with severe head trauma and was currently unresponsive. The room seemed to spin. The message had been left the previous evening. My phone had been out of service range up in the mountains, so I had received no notifications. I dropped my keys on the counter, turned around, and ran out the door, completely forgetting the flowers. The drive to the county hospital was a blur of traffic lights and crushing anxiety. I practically ran through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room, demanding to know where my wife was. A sympathetic nurse guided me to the intensive care unit on the 3rd floor. The smell of antiseptic and rubbing alcohol here was entirely different from the harsh bleach in my hallway, but it was just as terrifying. I stopped outside room 312. Through the heavy glass window, I saw her. My beautiful, vibrant Patty was lying in a hospital bed, looking incredibly small and frail. Her head was wrapped in thick white bandages, and a bulky plastic tube was inserted down her throat, connecting her to a mechanical ventilator that breathed for her. The rhythmic hissing of the machine was the only sound in the room. I placed my hand against the cold glass, feeling tears stream down my wrinkled cheeks. I felt a profound, agonizing helplessness. I needed to find the doctor. I needed to know what happened to the woman who was my entire world. I wiped my face, took a deep breath, and walked down the sterile corridor toward the waiting lounge. I expected to find my 40-year-old son Colin pacing the floor. I expected to see his wife Megan crying into a tissue. What I saw instead stopped me dead in my tracks. Colin and Megan were sitting on a comfortable leather sofa in the corner of the lounge. They were not crying. They were not comforting each other. Colin was casually leaning back, his legs crossed, wearing a perfectly tailored designer jacket. Megan was sipping from a large iced coffee cup, smiling brightly. Between them, spread open on the small glass table, was a glossy brochure for a highly exclusive commercial real estate development. I watched as Megan pointed at something on the page, and Colin chuckled, nodding his head in agreement. They looked like two people sitting in a luxury airport lounge waiting for a vacation flight. They did not look like people whose mother was currently fighting for her life on a breathing machine 50 feet away. I stood in the hallway, letting the reality of their complete indifference wash over me. I forced my hands to uncurl from fists. I plastered a look of weary confusion on my face and walked into the lounge. Colin looked up and immediately dropped his smile. He hastily folded the real estate brochure and tossed it into his leather briefcase. Megan sat up straight, putting on a mask of deep, tragic concern that was so utterly fake it made my stomach turn. "Dad?" "You are here," Colin said, standing up to give me a stiff, uncomfortable hug. "We tried calling you all night. It is terrible, just terrible." I looked him straight in the eye, holding on to my trembling emotions. "What happened, Colin? How did she get hurt?" Colin let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. "It was a freak accident, Dad. Mom tripped on that loose Persian carpet near the bottom of the staircase. She fell backwards and hit her head on the stone edge of the fireplace. Megan and I came over to bring her dinner and found her unconscious on the floor. It was awful." Megan reached out and patted my arm, her manicured nails digging slightly into my sleeve. "We were so scared, Calvin. We called the ambulance right away. The doctors say the swelling in her brain is severe." I stared at the two of them. A cold, dark realization began to form in the back of my mind. There was no loose Persian carpet near the staircase. I had personally rolled that carpet up and moved it to the attic 3 weeks ago because Patty thought it was a tripping hazard, and the fireplace was a good 10 feet away from the bottom of the stairs. It was physically impossible to trip on the stairs and hit your head on that stone hearth. But I did not call him a liar. I simply nodded, acting the part of the devastated, confused old man. "I am just glad you two were there." I mumbled, my voice breaking intentionally. "The medical bills, this is going to cost a fortune. I need to go to the administration desk to give them my insurance information." Colin quickly held up his hand, stopping me. "Actually, Dad, do not worry about that. Since we could not reach you and the hospital needed immediate deposits for her emergency surgery, I went ahead and took temporary administrative control of Mom's daily banking accounts. I already handled the preliminary fees. You just focus on being here for her." He smiled, a reassuring son taking care of his elderly father smile. It was flawless. But behind his eyes I saw the greedy, desperate glint of a man who thought he had just won the lottery. "Thank you, Colin," I said softly. "You are a good son." I turned and walked away from them, heading straight for the elevators. I did not go to the ICU. I went down to the first-floor billing department. I approached the clerk at the desk and handed her my identification, asking for a complete printout of my wife's medical charges and any payments made toward her account in the last 24 hours. The clerk typed on her keyboard for a moment and then looked up at me with a sympathetic smile. "Mr. Foster, there is an outstanding balance for the emergency room admittance, but no payments have been made on this account yet. The financial department usually waits until the patient is stabilized before requesting deposits." My blood turned to ice. Colin had lied about the carpet. He had lied about the fireplace. And he had just lied about paying the medical fees. I walked out of the billing office and stepped into the quiet, isolated hospital stairwell. My hands were perfectly steady now. The grief had been entirely replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I pulled out my smartphone and opened my secure private banking application. Patty and I kept a modest joint checking account for daily expenses, which is what Colin assumed was the extent of our wealth. He did not know about the private high-yield investment account Patty kept solely in her name, a fund we had been building for charitable donations. I accessed Patty's transaction history. My breath caught in my throat. Exactly 1 hour before the ambulance was dispatched to my house, there had been a massive wire transfer initiated from Patty's private account. The amount was exactly $350,000. The destination was a holding company registered under Colin's name. The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying precision. The missing carpet, the bleach on the floor, the missing money, and my wife bleeding on the hardwood. Colin had not found Patty unconscious. He and Megan had confronted her for the money. When she refused, they attacked her. And then they spent an hour bleaching my floors and stealing her life savings before they bothered to call an ambulance. They thought they had gotten away with it. They thought the old man would just weep quietly by the hospital bed while they bought commercial real estate with bloody money. I scrolled down to my contacts and dialed a number I rarely used. The phone rang twice before a sharp, professional voice answered. Stephen Palmer, Wealth Management. Stephen, I said, my voice echoing softly in the concrete stairwell. It is Calvin Foster. Calvin, it is good to hear from you. How can I assist you today? Listen to me carefully. Stephen, I said, my tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. I need you to execute a total asset lockdown immediately. Freeze every single checking, savings, and investment account tied to the Foster name. Freeze the trust funds. Cancel all supplementary credit cards issued to Colin and Megan. I want a complete, impenetrable financial wall built around my estate within the next 60 seconds. There was a brief pause on the other line as Stephen processed the gravity of the request. Consider it done, Calvin. Is there an emergency? Yes, I replied, staring at the heavy metal door of the stairwell. My son just declared war on his own family, and I am going to make sure he does not have a single dime to defend himself. I found a small plastic chair tucked away in a quiet alcove near the main hospital cafeteria. From this hidden vantage point, I had a perfectly clear view of the cash registers and the food line. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed incessantly overhead, casting a sickly pale glow over the white linoleum floor. I sat there with my hands folded neatly in my lap, focusing entirely on my breathing. The initial shock and the burning anger inside me had distilled into something much colder and far more dangerous. I was no longer a terrified, grieving husband, reacting blindly to a family tragedy. I was an experienced engineer sitting back and watching the structural integrity of my son's life begin to crack under immense pressure. I knew I did not have to wait very long. About 20 minutes after my quiet phone call to Stephen, I saw Colin and Megan walking down the brightly lit corridor toward the food court. They were walking briskly, and they still carried that same repulsive, arrogant energy. Megan had her expensive designer leather handbag slung over her shoulder, and Colin had his latest smartphone pressed tightly to his ear. He was talking animatedly, using broad hand gestures, discussing profit margins and commercial zoning permits. They were completely disconnected from the brutal reality of the intensive care unit upstairs, where my wife was fighting for her next breath. They stepped casually into the cafeteria line, grabbing expensive bottled water and a few prepackaged sandwiches without a care in the world. I watched them closely as they finally reached the front of the line. The cashier was a young, tired-looking woman wearing a blue hospital apron. Colin barely acknowledged her existence. He continued his loud phone conversation and carelessly pulled a sleek, heavy titanium credit card from his designer wallet, tossing it onto the metal counter. The cashier politely scanned their items and ran the metallic card through the electronic payment machine. She waited a moment, staring at the small digital screen, and then tapped it with her finger. She ran the card through the slot a second time. I leaned forward slightly in my plastic chair. The trap I had carefully laid was finally springing. The cashier politely interrupted Colin, telling him in a quiet voice that his card had been declined. Colin let out a loud, annoyed sigh, rolling his eyes as if he were dealing with an incompetent child. He told the person on the phone to hold for a second. He snapped at the cashier, claiming her old machine was obviously broken, and shoved a different gold-colored card across the counter. The cashier swiped it patiently. Declined. I could see the exact moment the arrogant annoyance on Colin's face shifted into genuine confusion. He pulled his phone away from his ear and stared blankly at the cashier. He raised his voice and told her to run it again because he knew there was over $50,000 in available credit on that specific card. The cashier simply shook her head and quietly suggested he step aside and contact his banking institution. Megan stepped forward now, looking visibly irritated by the delay. She told Colin to just move out of the way and let her pay so they could get back to their important business calls. She unzipped her handbag and pulled out her own platinum card, which was linked directly to their primary joint marital account. She handed it to the cashier with a condescending smile. The cashier swiped the platinum card. The machine beeped a sharp, flat tone. Declined. Megan gasped softly, pulling her hand back as if the plastic payment terminal had physically burned her fingers. A small line of hungry, tired hospital staff had formed behind them, and people were beginning to stare at the wealthy couple holding up the line. Colin's face turned a deep, ugly shade of crimson. He aggressively snatched all his cards off the counter, muttering foul curses under his breath. He shoved the sandwiches and water bottles back toward the frightened cashier and grabbed Megan firmly by the elbow, steering her roughly out of the cafeteria area. His phone was still tightly gripped in his hand, but he was no longer talking about his real estate zoning permits. He was furiously tapping the glass screen, desperately trying to log into his mobile banking application. I watched his thumbs move frantically across the digital keyboard. Then he stopped dead in his tracks right in the middle of the corridor. His broad shoulders dropped heavily. I knew exactly what he was seeing on that small glowing screen. Account frozen. Access denied. Please contact your branch administrator immediately. Absolute, unadulterated terror washed over Colin's face. He looked at his wife and whispered something frantic and breathless. Megan dropped her handbag straight onto the floor, completely ignoring the fact that the fine leather landed directly in a sticky puddle of spilled coffee. Her face went entirely pale, losing all its previous haughty color. The $350,000 they had violently stolen from my wife was locked safely behind the impenetrable financial firewall Stephen had just erected on my behalf. They had absolutely no access to the stolen funds, and their own personal lines of credit had been choked off as collateral damage. They were suddenly and completely broke, standing in the middle of a public hospital corridor. Colin looked up, breathing fast, and frantically scanned the crowded hallway. He was looking for his easy target. He was looking for the clueless, grieving old man he could easily manipulate. I slowly stood up from my plastic chair in the alcove. I made sure to stoop my shoulders slightly, curving my spine to look older and smaller. I adjusted my face into an expression of perfect, helpless bewilderment and shuffled slowly out into the open hallway, right into his line of sight. Colin spotted me instantly and practically sprinted across the linoleum floor. Megan followed closely behind him, her high heels clicking rapidly and erratically against the hard surface. "Dad!" Colin practically shouted as he reached me, grabbing me roughly by both shoulders. His grip was painfully tight, and his hands were actually shaking with adrenaline. "What is going on with the bank accounts, Dad? Have you done something? Have you called the bank today?" I looked up at him, widening my eyes and letting my jaw drop slightly in mock surprise. I made sure my voice sounded shaky, weak, and incredibly confused. "What do you mean, Colin?" I asked, stammering slightly over my words. "Bank accounts. I just went downstairs to try and get some fresh air. I am so worried about your mother I cannot even think straight right now." Why are you yelling at me in the middle of the hallway? Colin let go of my shoulders and ran both of his hands through his perfectly styled hair, ruining the expensive cut and making him look unhinged. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving up and down. "The credit cards are not working, Dad," he said, his voice rising in uncontrollable panic. "My personal cards are declining. Megan's business cards are declining. I just tried to log into Mom's administrative account to check the liquid balances, and the whole banking system locked me out completely. It says all the accounts are entirely frozen due to a suspected security breach." I brought a trembling, wrinkled hand up to my chest, acting as though his panicked words were causing me immense physical distress. "A security breach," I repeated slowly, my voice cracking with perfect theatrical timing. "Oh my God, Colin. Do you think someone managed to steal your mother's identity while she was hurt? We have to call the police right this second." I knew it. I knew something terrible was happening today behind our backs. Colin quickly reached out and grabbed my arm again, squeezing so hard it bruised. "No, Dad." "Do not call the police," he hissed rapidly. He said the word police as if it were a physical blow to his stomach. "We absolutely do not need the police involved in our family finances right now. It is probably just a stupid automated bank error. Think, Dad. Try to remember exactly what you did before you drove to the hospital today." I shook my head slowly from side to side, letting a single tear slip down my cheek. "I did not do anything, Colin," I whispered, looking at him with wide, innocent, helpless eyes. "I came home from the cabin and found the house completely empty. I heard the terrible voicemail on the machine and I drove straight here without stopping. I do not even have my leather wallet on me right now. I left it sitting on the kitchen counter in my rush. I was just going to ask you if you could buy me a simple cup of black coffee because I do not have a single dollar in my pocket. How could I possibly freeze the banking accounts, Colin? I do not even know the secure passwords to your mother's online banking profiles. She always handled all the complicated computer stuff for our household. You know I am completely terrible with modern technology." I watched the realization sink into his eyes. He believed me. He believed he was completely ruined by an automated bank error, and there was absolutely nothing his helpless old father could do to save him. Colin squeezed my shoulder tightly and told me to stay exactly where I was. He put on his best fake reassuring voice and promised he would go sort out the banking error right now. He grabbed Megan by the hand and practically dragged her down the corridor toward the emergency exit stairwell. They thought I would just sit there in my plastic chair like an obedient, frightened child waiting for them to return. The moment they turned the corner out of my sight, I stood up. My posture straightened immediately. The trembling in my hands ceased entirely. I walked quietly down the brightly lit hallway, keeping my footsteps completely silent against the polished linoleum floor. I reached the heavy painted metal door of the stairwell. It was propped open just a tiny fraction of an inch by a discarded plastic door wedge. I leaned my shoulder against the cold metal frame and pressed my ear directly to the narrow gap. The acoustics of the concrete stairwell amplified their hushed, frantic voices perfectly. I did not miss a single syllable of their conversation. Megan was absolutely furious. Her voice was a sharp, venomous whisper echoing off the gray concrete walls. She demanded to know what Colin was going to do to fix this disaster. She reminded him in a vicious tone that they were legally obligated to wire the $350,000 to the escrow account by tomorrow morning. I could hear her pacing back and forth, her expensive high heels clicking sharply and rhythmically against the concrete steps. She stated clearly that the massive midtown commercial property deal was going to collapse completely if they missed that strict deadline. Colin tried to calm her down, but his voice was shaking with uncontrolled panic. He told her to lower her voice before someone heard them. He insisted that the money was sitting right there in his holding company, and that the central banking system just needed time to reset its security protocols. He actually called me a stupid old man, claiming I lacked the mental capacity to have done anything deliberately to their accounts. But Megan was not listening to his weak excuses. She stopped pacing abruptly and confronted him directly. She asked him if he truly understood the terrifying reality of their current financial situation. She reminded him that they did not just borrow money from a traditional bank to fund their massive portion of the Midtown project. This was the missing piece of the puzzle I had been waiting for. I closed my eyes and listened intently as the dark, ugly truth of their sheer desperation finally spilled out into the open air. Colin had drastically overextended his real estate firm many months ago. He desperately wanted to buy into a massive luxury development project in the city center to elevate his social status, but his personal credit was already stretched to the absolute limit. No legitimate financial institution in the entire state would approve him for another loan. So he went looking for alternative financing in the darkest corners of the city. He found ruthless men who did not ask for credit scores or standard background checks. He borrowed money from men who demanded exorbitant weekly interest rates and collateral paid in blood. Megan's voice trembled uncontrollably as she spoke. She told Colin that the violent men they borrowed from were not going to sit around and wait for a banking system to reset itself. She mentioned a man named Silas. She said Silas had explicitly promised to send his associates to their personal residence if the wire transfer was not completed by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. She was crying now, not shedding fake tears for her mother-in-law in the hospital, but crying genuine, terrified tears for her own physical safety. She reminded Colin loudly that they had put up their own luxury cars and their high-end downtown apartment as direct collateral for the shadow loan. If they defaulted on the payment, they would lose absolutely everything they owned. They would be left completely destitute, and their lives would be in genuine physical danger. Colin slammed his heavy hand against the metal handrail of the stairs. The sharp, hollow ringing sound echoed all the way up the stairway. He cursed loudly and bitterly. He said they had done absolutely everything right. He said they had taken care of his mother when she stubbornly refused to give them the investment money willingly. He actually said those exact horrifying words, "taken care of her." My blood ran ice cold in my veins. Hearing the casual, callous way he referenced attacking his own mother just to secure a real estate investment destroyed any lingering trace of paternal sympathy I might have still held in my heart. He tried to justify his violent actions to Megan by claiming Patty was just uselessly hoarding the family wealth for no good reason while he was actively trying to build a massive financial empire. Megan told him his precious empire was currently burning to the ground. She said they needed liquid cash right this very second to survive the night. She aggressively suggested they go back out into the waiting room and physically force me to call the bank to unlock the accounts. Colin immediately shot down that reckless idea. He accurately pointed out that if I called the bank and discovered the accounts were intentionally frozen by a private wealth manager, the entire bank error lie would be instantly exposed. He said I would start asking uncomfortable questions. He realized that if I saw the massive wire transfer on the transaction history, I would quickly connect the dots and realize they had stolen the money right before Patty ended up bleeding on the floor. Colin knew perfectly well that keeping me completely in the dark was their only chance of maintaining control. He took a deep, ragged breath, trying to regain control of his spiraling panic. He told Megan he had a brilliant backup plan to save them both. He said he personally knew a corrupt private notary public who owed him a massive favor from a previous shady business deal. He explained that since I was currently distracted and emotionally destroyed by the hospital situation, they had the perfect window of opportunity. He told Megan he was going to quickly draft a forged medical power of attorney document. He planned to use that forged legal document to secure a massive emergency bridge loan using my completely paid-off house as collateral. He believed my property held immense equity and could easily cover their debts. He confidently told Megan he could get the fraudulent bridge loan approved and funded by tomorrow afternoon, effectively paying off Silas and saving their commercial real estate deal without anyone ever knowing. Megan asked him how he planned to get my required signature on the loan documents. Colin laughed, a cold, breathless, terrible sound. He said he did not need my signature at all. He said the corrupt notary would stamp the document without me ever being present in the room. He said all he needed was a few hours away from the hospital to file the fraudulent paperwork and secure the fast cash. He told Megan to go back out to the cafeteria and babysit me. He instructed her to keep me crying and drinking bad hospital coffee while he went to steal the remaining equity of the house I had lived in for 40 years. I pulled my ear away from the heavy painted metal door. I stepped back into the brightly lit hospital corridor. My heart was beating with a slow, terrifyingly steady rhythm. They thought they were incredibly clever. They thought they had found a brilliant legal loophole to escape the violent men they owed. They had absolutely no idea that I had already anticipated their extreme desperation. I knew exactly what a cornered rat would do when completely starved of its resources. I turned around and walked slowly back to my plastic chair in the hidden alcove. It was time to call Stephen Palmer again. It was time to let my son build his own gallows. I left the hospital quietly slipping out through the side emergency exit, while Colin and Megan were still trapped in their panicked argument inside the concrete stairwell. The drive back to my house was completely silent. The sun had set fully now, casting long, dark, intimidating shadows across the quiet suburban streets. I kept my hands firmly gripped on the leather steering wheel, feeling the rough texture beneath my palms. As a civil engineer, I had spent 40 long years of my life studying the fundamental, unyielding laws of physics. I spent decades calculating complex stress loads on giant concrete pillars and measuring the exact physical force required to break solid steel structural beams. I knew exactly how physical objects moved through space. I knew exactly how heavy objects fell when gravity took hold. Colin had looked me right in the eye and claimed his mother tripped on a loose Persian carpet at the base of the staircase. He said she fell backward, hitting the back of her head on the sharp stone ledge of the fireplace hearth. But my mind instantly processed the spatial geometry of my living room, and I knew that physical trajectory was absolutely impossible. The bottom wooden step of our staircase was exactly 10 feet away from the stone fireplace. A human body, falling from a standing position at that specific angle, could not possibly travel that massive horizontal distance without a severe external force acting upon it. Patty did not just lose her balance. Patty did not stumble. She was pushed with immense physical violence, or she was struck. I parked my truck in the driveway and walked slowly up the brick pathway to the front door. The heavy, pungent chemical smell of industrial bleach hit my senses again, the exact second I turned the brass key in the lock. It was a sterile, dead smell that did not belong in a home filled with 40 years of warm memories. I did not turn on the main overhead lights. I wanted the house to remain exactly as they had left it. I walked through the dark hallway, guided only by the pale silver moonlight filtering through the large front living room windows. I walked straight past the pristine floors and headed directly down the narrow wooden stairs into my basement workshop. My workshop was my private sanctuary. It was a perfectly organized room filled with precision instruments and professional-grade diagnostic tools. I walked past my heavy wooden workbenches and opened my reinforced metal equipment cabinet. I reached past the heavy steel wrenches and grabbed a specific black protective hard case. Inside the padded foam of the case was a high-powered commercial-grade ultraviolet diagnostic flashlight. During my long engineering career, I used this exact specialized tool to inspect deep hidden microfractures in massive load-bearing concrete walls. I used it to detect invisible chemical leaks in highly pressurized industrial pipes. I knew the strict scientific principles of light spectrums. I knew that organic biological materials like human blood violently absorbed ultraviolet light, appearing as dark, black, empty voids. I also knew that harsh chemical cleaning agents like industrial bleach would aggressively reflect the ultraviolet light, causing it to glow bright, fluorescent blue and white in the darkness. I grabbed the heavy, cold metal flashlight, feeling its solid weight in my hands, and walked slowly back upstairs to the main floor. I stood perfectly still at the bottom of the wooden staircase. I clicked the heavy rubber button on the side of the flashlight. A thick, intense beam of deep purple light instantly cut through the absolute darkness of the silent house. I swept the bright beam slowly and methodically across the bottom wooden steps and the surrounding polished hardwood floor. I examined every single inch of the wood grain. The floorboards looked completely normal under the ultraviolet spectrum. There were no bright glowing streaks of bleach here. There were no dark absorbing spots of organic matter. If Patty had truly tripped right here, like Colin had so violently and convincingly insisted, there would undoubtedly be some trace of physical evidence left behind. There would be a dark scuff mark from the rubber sole of her shoe slipping on the wood. There would be a tiny drop of blood from the initial traumatic impact. But the floor near the stairs was completely bare and completely devoid of any trauma whatsoever. Colin had intentionally lied about the exact location of the tragic incident to easily explain away the massive traumatic head injury. But my son had never possessed an analytical mind. He had not been smart enough to realize that an entirely empty, pristine crime scene was just as loud and just as incriminating as a desperately bloody one. I turned my back to the empty wooden staircase and walked slowly with heavy, deliberate steps toward the center of the dark living room. I pointed the purple beam of light directly toward the large, rough stone fireplace. The visual result was instantaneous and absolutely horrifying. The polished hardwood floor leading directly up to the raised stone hearth lit up like a chaotic, glowing neon map of pure terror. Broad, frantic, bright, glowing blue streaks of bleach completely covered the wooden floorboards. I could clearly see the wide, chaotic, swirling patterns of the cloth rags Megan must have used to desperately scrub the wood. The glowing blue trails overlapped each other, showing the manic speed and the blind panic of their cleanup effort. They had poured massive, reckless amounts of the harsh, toxic chemical directly onto the floor, right in front of the fireplace, trying desperately to erase the physical evidence of their violent greed. I stepped closer, feeling my breathing become incredibly shallow and my chest grow tight. I moved the ultraviolet beam up from the glowing wooden floor and focused the intense light directly onto the rough gray stones of the fireplace hearth. Right at the sharpest, jagged corner of the raised stone ledge, I finally saw the absolute truth. Amidst the chaotic, glowing blue smears of bleach, there was a dense, jagged, pitch-black void. It was a specific area where the ultraviolet light was being completely absorbed and swallowed by the surface. It was a thick, heavy, dark stain of human blood that had soaked deep into the porous, rough rock where the liquid bleach could simply not reach it. My hands began to tremble with a cold, terrifying rage. I lowered the purple light slightly and looked at the heavy brass fireplace tools resting quietly on their heavy iron stand. The long, heavy brass poker was sitting slightly out of alignment with the shovel and the brush. I moved the purple beam over the thick brass handle and down toward the heavy weighted pointed tip. Another dark black void appeared under the light, right near the heavy base of the solid brass poker. Someone had quickly and carelessly wiped the smooth metal shaft, but the thick blood had settled deep down into the intricate, decorative, engraved grooves near the handle. The horrific, brutal reality of my wife's final conscious moments played out in my mind with terrifying, crystalline clarity. Patty had somehow discovered the unauthorized massive wire transfer. She had confronted them right here in the center of our living room. She had adamantly and bravely refused to let them steal $350,000 to fund their shady, desperate real estate deal. Colin had become completely enraged by her stubborn refusal. He had grabbed the heavy brass poker and struck his own mother, or he had pushed her with massive, violent force against the sharp stone hearth to permanently silence her. They had left her bleeding on the floor while they scrubbed the wood. I slowly reached out and turned off the ultraviolet flashlight. The living room instantly plunged back into complete, suffocating darkness. The glowing blue lies and the dark black truth vanished from sight, but they were permanently burned into my mind. My beautiful wife was currently lying in a sterile hospital bed with a thick plastic tube forcing mechanical air into her damaged lungs simply because our greedy son wanted to buy a commercial office building. The time for playing the confused, helpless, grieving old man was officially over. My investigation was complete. It was no longer a matter of protecting our financial assets. It was a matter of calculated total destruction. I pulled my phone from my pocket and prepared to call Stephen Palmer. It was time to start building a permanent, inescapable execution trap. I left the suffocating darkness of my home and drove straight into the heart of the sleeping city. The glowing dashboard clock read midnight, but sleep was the furthest thing from my mind. I navigated the empty streets until I reached a sleek glass and steel high-rise building overlooking the dark waters of the bay. This was the private residential office of Stephen Palmer. Stephen was not just a typical estate lawyer handling simple wills and testaments. He was a ruthless legal architect who specialized in building impenetrable fortresses around massive corporate wealth. I had hired him 15 years ago when my specialized engineering patents began generating serious quiet income. I had saved his own father from a predatory corporate bankruptcy many years before that, and Stephen owed me a debt of loyalty that money could never buy. He knew how to keep absolute secrets, and he knew how to utterly destroy anyone who threatened his clients. The night security guard recognized me immediately and nodded silently as I bypassed the main desk and took the private elevator straight to the secure penthouse level. Stephen was waiting for me in his massive study. He was wearing a dark, tailored suit, even at this late hour, pouring 2 glasses of aged scotch from a heavy crystal decanter. I declined the drink with a simple shake of my head. I needed my mind to remain perfectly sharp for the calculations ahead. I sat down in a heavy leather chair across from his mahogany desk and told him exactly what I had found on the living room floor. I described the glowing blue trails of the industrial bleach and the dark, absorbing void of my wife's, blood soaking deep into the porous stone hearth. I watched Stephen's face harden into a mask of pure, cold fury. The professional, polite demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by the calculating predator I paid him to be. He immediately reached for his desk phone, suggesting we call the chief of police and present the ultraviolet evidence to secure an immediate arrest warrant for attempted murder. I reached across the wide desk and firmly placed my hand over his, stopping him from lifting the receiver. I told him that calling the police right now would be a massive strategic mistake. If we brought in the authorities prematurely, Colin would instantly invoke his right to remain silent. He would use whatever credit he had left to hire a sleazy, aggressive defense attorney and claim Patty simply fell during an argument. The physical evidence of the bleach was incredibly compelling, but without a direct confession, a clever lawyer could drag the trial out for years, inflicting endless trauma on Patty when she woke up. I told Stephen I did not want a long, messy public trial. I wanted absolute, immediate devastation. I wanted Colin to trap himself so thoroughly and so hopelessly that he would beg the police to arrest him, just to escape the financial and physical hell I was about to unleash upon him. Stephen slowly sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers together. He asked me what my exact parameters were for this trap. I laid out the psychological profile of my own son using the same cold logic I would use to analyze a failing concrete pillar. I explained that Colin was currently cornered by violent loan sharks with a strict 8:00 morning deadline. I told Stephen that Colin was deeply arrogant, but highly predictable under extreme stress. Since I had permanently frozen all the liquid cash assets, his only remaining option was to leverage physical real estate. I explained the desperate conversation I had overheard in the hospital stairwell. Colin was planning to use a corrupt public notary to forge a medical power of attorney. He was going to use that completely fraudulent document to apply for a massive emergency bridge loan using my entirely paid-off house as direct collateral. Stephen smiled a thin, dangerous smile, realizing the perfection of the incoming mistake. He noted that any legitimate high-risk lender would automatically run a title check and route the final authorization directly through his law firm, since Stephen was legally listed as the primary custodian of the Foster family estate. "That is exactly what I am counting on," I replied, my voice completely steady. I instructed Stephen to remain at his desk and wait for the urgent loan authorization request to come across his secure computer network tomorrow morning. I told him that when the fraudulent paperwork arrived, he was not to flag it for fraud. He was not to cancel it or alert the authorities. Instead, I wanted him to completely and officially approve the transaction. I wanted him to let the massive loan process seamlessly making Colin believe he had won. But I needed Stephen to execute one crucial deadly modification to the final destination of the funds. While I was sitting in that elegant penthouse carefully engineering his total financial execution, my son was desperately digging his own grave on the other side of town. Colin had driven his luxury car to a poorly lit abandoned strip mall on the desolate outskirts of the city. He met with a disgraced former real estate broker who still held an active public notary license. This man was a known bottom feeder who specialized in stamping shady contracts for a quick cash bribe, no questions asked. Colin sat in the cramped, windowless back room of that dingy office, sweating profusely under the flickering fluorescent lights. The terrifying threat of Silas and the loan sharks was burning in his mind. He pulled out a blank standard medical power of attorney form from his leather briefcase. He filled in my name as the incapacitated delegator and his own name as the sole authorized agent. He deliberately checked the specific legal boxes that granted him total unlimited control over all my physical real estate properties and all my financial assets, claiming I was mentally incompetent due to sudden, severe psychological trauma. Then came the final, irreversible step into complete criminality. Colin picked up a black ink pen. He did not hesitate. He did not feel a single ounce of guilt for the mother currently bleeding in the hospital, or the father he was actively and viciously betraying. He pressed the pen firmly to the paper and fluidly forged my signature on the bottom line. He had practiced my exact signature for years when he was an arrogant teenager trying to fake bad high school report cards. The corrupt notary did not ask a single question shown about the sudden late-night emergency. He simply took the thick envelope of bribe money, stamped the heavy official state seal onto the forged document, and signed his own name, validating the massive, dangerous lie. With the fraudulent power of attorney officially secured, Colin immediately opened his laptop computer right there on the dirty desk. He accessed a high-risk private lending portal. These were aggressive lenders who did not care about standard credit scores or ethical banking practices. They only cared about hard physical property collateral and charging exorbitant weekly interest rates. Colin quickly uploaded the forged power of attorney document. He uploaded the legal property deed to my suburban home, which he had secretly photographed weeks ago while pretending to visit his mother. He formally requested an expedited commercial bridge loan for exactly $400,000. He requested the massive funds to be wired directly into his personal holding company account at the earliest possible business hour, claiming an absolute family emergency. He aggressively typed in the final submission command and watched the digital loading bar complete the transaction. The private lender's automated financial system instantly flagged the high-value suburban property. Following standard legal protocols, the system sent a mandatory verification ping directly to Stephen Palmer's secure legal network, exactly as I had mathematically predicted. Colin closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, letting out a massive, shaky breath of relief. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. He honestly believed he had just outsmarted everyone. He believed the corrupt notary had given him the golden ticket to pay off his dangerous debt and secure his midtown real estate empire. He thought his father was just a weak old fool crying alone in a hospital waiting room, completely oblivious to the millions of dollars moving around him in the dark. He had absolutely no idea that his perfectly forged loan application was flying straight into the jaws of a legal trap so tightly coiled it would snap his entire life in half. I finished my meeting with Stephen as the first pale light of dawn began to break over the city skyline. The board was perfectly set. The forged documents were submitted. The violent loan sharks were waking up. It was time for the sun to rise on the most devastating day of my son's life. The pale morning sunlight crept slowly across the sterile white floor of the intensive care unit. I sat in a stiff plastic chair right beside my wife's bed, holding her cold, fragile hand in both of mine. The rhythmic mechanical hissing of the ventilator breathing for her was the only sound in the quiet room. Her chest rose and fell in a slow, artificial rhythm. I watched the steady green lines on the heart monitor, tracing the fragile beats of her life. The anger I had felt the night before had completely hardened into something resembling solid steel. I was no longer just a husband mourning a tragedy. I was the architect of a complete and total demolition. I gently brushed a stray lock of gray hair away from her bandaged forehead and whispered a quiet promise that the people who did this to her were about to lose absolutely everything. Exactly at 8 o'clock in the morning, my mobile phone vibrated silently in my coat pocket. I carefully let go of my wife's hand and stepped out into the quiet hospital corridor. It was Stephen Palmer. His voice was sharp and entirely devoid of morning pleasantries. "The automated legal alarm on my secure network just triggered Calvin," he said, his tone entirely professional and tightly controlled. "The private shadow lender system officially requested title verification on your suburban property exactly 15 minutes ago." Stephen explained that Colin had moved with terrifying speed. He had submitted a massive commercial bridge loan application for exactly $400,000. He had pledged the entire equity of my paid-off family home as the sole collateral. My son was trying to trade the roof over my head to save himself from the violent men he owed. I asked Stephen to describe the forged documentation. I could hear the rustling of heavy paper through the phone speaker. Stephen sounded almost insulted by the sheer amateur nature of the crime. Colin used a standard boilerplate medical power of attorney form he downloaded from a public website, Stephen explained with a cold scoff. He actually checked the boxes declaring you suddenly and permanently mentally incompetent. He granted himself total, absolute control over your physical real estate and your liquid assets. And the signature, Calvin, it is a highly confident forgery, but it lacks the heavy physical pressure of your actual handwriting. He even got a disgraced public notary from the east side of the city to stamp the official state seal on the document late last night. Stephen told me the notary was a known criminal who had barely kept his license after a massive real estate scandal 5 years ago. Stephen paused, taking a slow breath. He then laid out the standard legal procedure. "I have the fraud department on the other line, Calvin. I am ready to instantly flag the application. We can completely block the loan transfer report the corrupt notary to the state licensing board and have the police arrest Colin for felony forgery before he even finishes his morning coffee." Stephen was a brilliant lawyer, but he thought like a shield. He wanted to block the incoming attack and protect the asset. But I was an engineer, and I thought like a controlled demolition expert. I did not want to block the attack. I wanted to use the immense weight of the attack to crush the attacker. "Do not flag the application." "Stephen," I said, my voice low and completely steady, echoing slightly in the empty hospital hallway. "I do not want you to block a single thing. I want you to officially verify the clean title of the house and approve the commercial loan." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Stephen was rarely caught off guard, but my command had genuinely stunned him. "Calvin, you are asking me to officially validate a completely fraudulent legal document," he warned, his voice dropping to a cautious whisper. "If I approve this, the shadow lender is going to immediately release $400,000 based on a massive criminal lie. They will place a heavy physical lien on your family home. You are handing your son the exact weapon he needs to save his real estate deal." "I am not handing him a weapon, Stephen," I replied, staring through the glass window at my wife lying motionless in her hospital bed. "I am handing him a rope, and I am letting him tie the knot himself." I explained the exact structural flaw in Colin's desperate plan. If we blocked the loan right now, Colin would just scramble to find another illegal way to pay the loan sharks. He would remain desperate and unpredictable. I needed him to feel completely safe. I needed him to believe he had successfully outsmarted the entire system. Only then would he confidently walk into the final trap without looking over his shoulder. I gave Stephen my exact instructions. As the legal custodian of the Foster Family Trust, Stephen had the ultimate legal authority to dictate how any loans secured by our properties were physically dispersed. I told him to authorize the loan, but to legally mandate that the massive funds could not be wired into Colin's personal holding company. Instead, Stephen was to use his custodial power to forcefully route the $400,000 directly into a secure blind escrow account. This specific escrow account was completely controlled by the charitable foundation trust I had quietly established 5 years ago. Stephen let out a low, sharp breath of pure realization. The brilliance of the legal maneuver clicked into place in his mind. He understood exactly what I was building. By forcing the money into the charitable escrow account, the shadow lender would still legally register the loan as successfully funded. The automated system would instantly send Colin a digital notification telling him his $400,000 had been approved and released. Colin would see that glorious approval message and believe his massive debts were entirely solved. He would proudly walk into his commercial real estate closing later today, thinking he was a wealthy, powerful businessman. But the money would never actually reach his hands. It would be entirely swallowed by an untouchable philanthropic trust account that he did not even know existed. He would have successfully committed massive federal bank fraud. He would have pledged a house he did not actually own to violent loan sharks, and he would have absolutely $0 to show for his massive criminal effort. Execute the routing modification. Stephen I commanded, feeling a cold, deep satisfaction settling into my bones. Approve the forged document. Let the shadow lender release the funds and trap every single penny inside the charity escrow. Make sure the automated approval message gets sent directly to Colin's phone. I want him to smile today. I want him to feel absolute victorious relief right up until the exact second his entire world collapses. Consider it done, Calvin, Stephen replied, his voice now carrying a sharp, dangerous edge of anticipation. The trap is officially armed. I will monitor the wire transfer and confirm when the funds are fully locked inside the charity trust. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I turned around and walked quietly back into the intensive care unit. I sat back down in the stiff plastic chair and gently took Patty's cold hand in mine once again. The sun was fully up now, washing the pale hospital room in bright morning light. Somewhere on the other side of the city, my son was about to receive a digital notification that would make him feel like a king. He had absolutely no idea that he had just signed his own financial death warrant and that his quiet elderly father was the one holding the pen. Colin walked out of the bright hospital lobby and stepped into the dim concrete parking garage. The air was thick with the smell of exhaust fumes and damp cement. He was exhausted from the long night of lying to my face and scrubbing his mother's blood off my hardwood floors, but he was currently riding a massive wave of pure adrenaline. Just 10 minutes ago, his expensive smartphone had buzzed in his pocket. It was the automated digital notification from the private shadow lender. The message clearly stated that his massive $400,000 commercial bridge loan had been officially approved. The message claimed the funds were currently being processed for immediate wire transfer. Colin felt absolutely invincible. He believed he had successfully played the entire system. He believed his forged document was a stroke of absolute genius and that his financial problems were completely over. He twirled the keys to his luxury sedan around his finger, whistling a quiet tune as he walked deeper into the shadowy garage. He reached his sleek black car parked in an isolated corner of the 3rd level. He pressed the button on his remote to unlock the doors. The headlights flashed briefly, illuminating the dark concrete pillars. As the light faded, 2 large, heavy shadows detached themselves from the concrete wall directly behind his vehicle. Colin froze mid-step. His arrogant smile vanished instantly. 2 men stepped into the dim yellow light of the overhead parking lamps. They were not wearing cheap leather jackets or looking like common street criminals. They were dressed in immaculate dark suits, looking like high-end corporate security contractors. That made them infinitely more terrifying. These were the professional debt collectors employed by Silas. They were men who did not make empty threats and who never left a job unfinished. The taller of the two men stepped forward. His footsteps made absolutely no sound on the hard concrete. He moved with the frightening predatory grace of a man entirely comfortable with physical violence. Colin tried to take a step backward, but his back hit the cold metal door of his own car. He was completely trapped. The tall man stopped just inches away from Colin's face, invading his personal space entirely. The man did not shout or raise his voice. He spoke in a low, calm, entirely flat tone that echoed chillingly in the empty parking structure. "Silas sent us to check on his investment." "Colin," the man said quietly, "you have been very difficult to reach this morning. Our employer does not like it when his business partners ignore his phone calls, especially when those partners owe him a massive amount of money." Colin swallowed hard, his throat completely dry. His previous feelings of invincibility evaporated in an instant, replaced by raw physical terror. He stammered frantically, trying to explain that he had been in the hospital all night dealing with a sudden family medical emergency. He tried to sound like a grieving son, but his voice cracked with pathetic fear. The second man stepped forward, now leaning heavily against the hood of Colin's luxury car. He casually inspected his fingernails, ignoring Colin's frantic excuses. "We do not care about your family emergencies, Colin," the tall man interrupted smoothly. "We only care about the wire transfer." Silas was very clear about the timeline. You were supposed to have the entire balance transferred by 8 o'clock this morning. You missed the deadline. Silas is very disappointed. When Silas gets disappointed, people lose their property. Sometimes they lose their teeth. Sometimes they lose their wives. The explicit threat against Megan hung heavily in the damp air. Colin's hands began to shake uncontrollably. He remembered the terrifying reality of what these men were capable of doing. But then his mind grasped desperately at the digital lifeline he had just secured. He remembered the automated approval message sitting right there in his pocket. The forged loan had been approved. The money was supposedly on its way. The sheer arrogance that defined his entire personality suddenly came rushing back to him. He took a deep breath, forcing his shaking hands to be still. "You tell Silas he does not need to worry about anything," Colin said, his voice gaining a sudden burst of false confidence. "I have the money. It is completely secured. I just finalized a massive commercial bridge loan against a piece of prime suburban real estate. The lender approved the transfer 15 minutes ago." Colin reached slowly into his tailored jacket pocket. The two men tensed slightly, watching his hands carefully. Colin pulled out his smartphone and quickly unlocked the screen. He opened the secure portal for the private shadow lender and held the glowing screen up to the tall man's face. "Look at it," Colin demanded, his voice dripping with sudden arrogant pride. "Read the screen. The $400,000 is officially approved, and the wire transfer is currently processing into my holding account. The central banking system just needs a standard 24-hour clearing period for a transaction of this massive size." The tall man looked at the glowing screen for a long, silent moment. He read the official approval notice and the pending transfer status. His cold expression did not change, but he slowly nodded his head. He looked back at Colin, studying the arrogant, smug look that had returned to Colin's face. "Silas is not a bank, Colin," the man said softly. "He does not care about processing delays or automated messages. He cares about liquid cash resting securely in his own accounts." The man reached out and grabbed Colin firmly by the lapels of his expensive designer jacket. He pulled Colin forward effortlessly, lifting him slightly onto the tips of his toes. Colin gasped in sudden pain and fear, dropping his smartphone onto the hard concrete floor. The man brought his face so close that Colin could feel the cold breath on his skin. "You have exactly 24 hours, the man whispered, his voice sharp and deadly. "We will be waiting at your real estate closing tomorrow morning. If the escrow account is not fully funded by the time you sit down at that table, we will not ask for the money again. We will simply take everything you own. We will take this car. We will take your downtown apartment. And then we will take you and your wife for a very long drive." The man released his grip suddenly. Colin stumbled backward, hitting his car heavily and gasping for air. The two men turned around and walked silently back into the dark shadows of the parking garage, completely disappearing from sight. Colin stood there trembling violently in the dim yellow light. He slowly bent down and picked up his dropped smartphone. The screen was slightly cracked, but the digital approval message was still glowing brightly. Colin wiped the cold sweat from his forehead and let out a shaky breath. A slow, arrogant smirk spread across his face. He looked at the cracked screen and actually laughed out loud in the empty garage. He genuinely believed he had just stared down the most dangerous men in the city and won. He believed the money was coming to save him. He had absolutely no idea that the money was permanently locked inside my charitable trust, and that he was going to walk into his real estate closing tomorrow completely empty-handed. I sat in the stiff plastic chair beside my wife's hospital bed, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest under the thin white blanket. The rhythmic sound of the mechanical ventilator was the only constant noise in the silent room. I had been sitting there for hours playing the role of the devoted grieving husband perfectly. But my mind was actively calculating the next necessary move in this dangerous game. I knew my son Colin was currently down in the dark parking garage facing the violent consequences of his own massive greed. I also knew that his wife Megan was still lurking somewhere on the third floor of this hospital. She had been left behind to keep a watchful eye on me. But Megan was not just a passive observer. She was a deeply greedy and desperate woman who was currently watching her entire luxurious life burn to the ground. The automated bank error excuse Colin had given her was not enough to soothe her absolute terror. She needed direct access to the stolen $350,000 right now. I decided it was the perfect time to give her the opportunity she was desperately waiting for. I slowly stood up from the plastic chair, groaning softly, to emphasize my fake frailty. I stretched my back and walked out of the intensive care unit, leaving the heavy wooden door slightly ajar. I walked down the brightly lit linoleum corridor, heading slowly toward the nurse's station. I did not go all the way to the public break room. I simply turned the corner, stepping into the dark alcove near the supply closets. I stood perfectly still in the shadows and counted the passing seconds. I knew the exact psychological profile of a cornered thief. When the perceived threat leaves the immediate area, the thief will always creep out to finish the job. I waited exactly 3 minutes. Then I turned around and walked silently back toward my wife's hospital room, keeping my footsteps completely muffled against the polished floorboards. Through the large glass viewing window built into the heavy door, I saw exactly what I had engineered to happen. Megan had slipped inside the quiet room the very second she thought the coast was entirely clear. She was not standing by the metal bed frame weeping softly for her injured mother-in-law. She was not gently holding Patty's hand and offering quiet prayers for a swift medical recovery. She was standing aggressively over my helpless, comatose wife like a starving vulture circling a wounded animal. Her expensive designer clothes looked wrinkled, and her perfectly styled hair was beginning to fall out of place. Megan was holding a sleek black digital tablet in her left hand. It was a high-end professional device I recognized instantly. It was the highly secure biometric banking terminal Colin used for his massive corporate real estate transfers. The central banking system had completely locked them out of the massive funds they had violently stolen from my wife. Megan was incredibly manipulative, and she was smart enough to know exactly how high-level financial security protocols functioned. She knew that high-security private investment accounts required dual authentication to initiate an emergency password reset. A simple typed password was no longer enough. The banking application was demanding Patty's physical biometric fingerprint to bypass the frozen security wall and release the stolen funds. Megan had sneaked into this intensive care unit to physically assault a comatose woman just to steal her money a second time. I watched through the thick observation glass as she placed the digital tablet on the edge of the mattress. She reached down and violently grabbed my wife's right hand. She did not handle her with any care or basic human dignity. She roughly yanked Patty's limp arm toward the glowing screen, completely ignoring the delicate intravenous fluid tubes taped securely to her fragile, pale skin. I could see the sheer manic desperation on Megan's face. She was grinding her teeth together, pushing Patty's thumb directly onto the small glass scanning pad of the tablet. The screen flashed bright red, indicating a failed scan. Megan let out a frustrated, angry breath and tried to force the thumb down harder, bending my wife's fragile finger backward at a painful, unnatural angle. I did not shout for the hospital security guards. I did not rush frantically into the room to push her away. I simply reached out and opened the heavy wooden door, stepping inside and letting the metal latch click shut softly behind me. The quiet mechanical sound echoed loudly in the silent, isolated room. It was like a gunshot to Megan's frayed nerves. She gasped violently, dropping Patty's arm. The heavy digital tablet slipped from her trembling hands and landed face down on the thin hospital blanket. She spun around to face me, her eyes wide with sudden, absolute terror. Her chest was heaving up and down rapidly. She tried desperately to plaster that fake, sickeningly sweet daughter-in-law smile back onto her face, but the muscles in her cheeks were twitching uncontrollably with raw panic. "Oh, Calvin," she stammered, taking a quick, clumsy step away from the metal bed frame. "You startled me. I was just coming in to check on her while you were getting your coffee." Her poor hand looked so terribly cold lying there. I was just trying to rub some warmth back into her fingers. "It is so freezing in this hospital ward, do you not think so?" I did not answer her immediately. I walked slowly and deliberately across the small room. I did not look at the black digital tablet resting heavily on the blanket. I looked directly into her terrified, lying eyes. I let the comforting facade of the weak, confused elderly father completely drop away just for a fraction of a second. I straightened my posture, pulling my shoulders back, and stood tall. I let her see the cold, calculating, highly intelligent engineer standing right in front of her. "You have to be incredibly careful with her hands." "Megan," I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying whisper that barely carried over the rhythmic hissing of the mechanical breathing machine. "The skin is very fragile right now. Any sudden aggressive pressure or unexpected violent trauma could leave a permanent mark, just like the violent, unexpected trauma that put her in this hospital bed in the first place." Megan swallowed hard, her throat visibly bobbing. The fake, sweet smile completely melted away from her pale face, leaving nothing but raw, unadulterated fear. She stopped breathing for a long, terrible second. She realized in that exact moment that I was not a foolish, blind old man. She realized I knew exactly what had happened on the hardwood floor of my living room. She realized I knew about the bleach and the blood. I stepped closer to her, backing her slowly toward the cold, painted wall of the hospital room. "You know, Megan," I continued, keeping my tone perfectly flat and conversational, "I spent my entire professional career building massive structural foundations. I know exactly how heavy things collapse under pressure. When a foundation is built entirely on a massive lie, it never just cracks quietly. It shatters completely and violently. And anyone foolish enough to be standing inside that corrupted structure gets completely crushed under the massive weight." I slowly reached down and picked up the digital biometric tablet from the white blanket. I wiped the smooth glass screen very carefully on the sleeve of my cardigan sweater, erasing any trace of her frantic fingerprints. I handed the heavy device back to her, pressing it firmly against her chest. "I think you should leave this room right now, Megan," I whispered, staring straight into her dark, terrified soul. "I think you should go find your husband. I think you should prepare for the total collapse. Because when the heavy stones finally start falling from the sky, there will be absolutely nowhere left for you to hide." Megan snatched the black tablet from my hands, her fingers shaking so badly she almost dropped it again. She did not say a single word. She could not speak. The sheer psychological terror of my veiled threat had completely paralyzed her vocal cords. She turned and practically ran out of the intensive care unit, fleeing the quiet room like she was escaping a burning building. I watched her sprint down the brightly lit hospital corridor until she disappeared around the corner. I slowly turned back to my wife. I gently picked up her right hand, carefully adjusting the intravenous tubes Megan had recklessly tangled. I massaged her cold fingers, softly restoring the circulation. The trap was now fully armed, and the psychological pressure was absolute. Colin thought he was about to become a millionaire, and Megan knew they were both standing on the edge of a terrifying abyss. The final execution was going to be absolutely flawless. I knew exactly what was happening in that downtown office building at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. While I sat quietly holding my wife's hand in the hospital, my son was walking through the heavy revolving glass doors of the most prestigious commercial real estate firm in the city. Colin was wearing his finest tailored suit. He had spent an hour perfectly styling his hair and polishing his expensive leather shoes. He walked past the massive marble reception desk with his head held high, feeling like a true titan of industry. He genuinely believed he had successfully outsmarted everyone in his life. He thought he had beaten the violent loan sharks and completely manipulated his foolish elderly father. He felt absolutely invincible as the young receptionist led him down the carpeted hallway toward the primary executive boardroom. The boardroom was an intimidating space designed specifically to make men feel small, but Colin felt like he owned the entire building. A massive, polished mahogany table dominated the center of the room. Sitting on one side of the table were the three wealthy corporate developers who owned the Midtown commercial property. They were serious men in dark suits who did not have time for amateur investors. Sitting at the head of the long table was the senior escrow agent, an older, meticulous man with thick glasses and a completely emotionless face. Colin confidently took his seat across from the developers. He placed his expensive leather briefcase on the table and clicked the locks open. He pulled out his gold fountain pen and laid it carefully next to the thick stack of preliminary closing contracts. The senior escrow agent cleared his throat and opened his laptop computer. He looked over the heavy rim of his glasses and addressed the room in a dry, professional tone. He stated that all the preliminary physical inspections were complete and the commercial zoning permits were fully approved. The only remaining step to finalize the massive property transfer was the verification of the incoming $400,000 wire from Colin's private lending institution. Colin smiled a wide, arrogant smile. He leaned back in his heavy leather chair, steepling his fingers together in a gesture of supreme artificial confidence. He told the escrow agent to go ahead and refresh the banking portal because his private lender had confirmed the release of the massive funds early this morning. The escrow agent typed his secure password into the laptop and hit the enter key. The room was completely silent for a few long seconds. The agent nodded slowly, keeping his eyes fixed on the glowing screen. He announced that a wire transfer for exactly $400,000 had indeed just successfully landed in the firm's primary holding account. Colin let out a long, slow breath of absolute victorious relief. He reached out and picked up his gold fountain pen, ready to sign his name on the final binding documents. He looked across the table at the wealthy developers, expecting them to offer their hands in a respectful gesture of newly minted partnership. But the escrow agent did not slide the final contracts across the table. Instead, the older man frowned deeply. He leaned much closer to the computer screen, squinting his eyes in sudden, complete confusion. He tapped the keyboard several more times, his professional demeanor shifting into one of deep concern. He looked up from the screen and stared directly at Colin. The agent stated that there was a massive legal discrepancy in the routing instructions securely attached to the incoming wire transfer. Colin felt a tiny cold prickle of unease run down his spine, but he maintained his arrogant smirk. He casually waved his hand and told the agent it was probably just a minor clerical error from the shadow lender. He demanded that the agent print the final signature pages so they could close the massive deal and celebrate. The escrow agent shook his head slowly. "This is not a minor clerical error, Mr. Foster," the agent said, his voice dropping to a harsh, serious tone. "The automated clearinghouse routing numbers match our firm perfectly, but the legally binding beneficiary name on this massive wire does not match your commercial holding company. In fact, it explicitly forbids your commercial holding company from accessing a single penny of these funds." The three wealthy developers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The lead developer narrowed his eyes and asked the escrow agent to explain exactly what was happening. Colin dropped his gold pen onto the mahogany table. His heart began to beat with a sudden, frantic rhythm. He leaned forward and aggressively demanded to know whose name was on the wire transfer. The escrow agent turned the laptop screen slightly so the entire room could see the official banking document. The agent read the strict legal mandate attached directly to the wire transfer by the authorizing custodian. He announced to the silent room that the $400,000 were permanently restricted and legally bound to the Foster Family Philanthropic Trust. He read the attached legal stipulations out loud. The money was strictly designated for the purchase of land for public charitable use. It was absolutely legally prohibited from being used for any private commercial development or personal financial gain. Furthermore, the agent noted that the transfer was permanently locked by the legal custodian of the trust, a man named Stephen Palmer. All the blood instantly drained from Colin's face, leaving him looking like a pale, terrified ghost. The walls of the massive executive boardroom suddenly felt like they were rapidly closing in on him. He grabbed the edge of the heavy mahogany table, trying to steady his trembling hands. The horrifying truth hit his arrogant brain with the crushing physical force of a runaway freight train. His father had not been a confused, helpless old man crying in the hospital corridor. His father had known absolutely everything. His father had somehow discovered the forged power of attorney and intercepted the massive shadow loan. "I had intentionally allowed the fraudulent money to process just to trap it permanently inside an untouchable charity fund." The lead developer slammed his hand violently against the table, breaking the stunned silence in the room. He stood up, his face red with sudden, furious anger. He looked down at Colin with absolute disgust. He accused Colin of being a pathetic, broke amateur who was wasting their extremely valuable corporate time playing stupid financial games. The developer told the escrow agent to immediately cancel the entire transaction and officially dissolve the partnership contract. The three wealthy men packed up their briefcases and stormed out of the boardroom without looking back, leaving the heavy glass doors swinging wildly behind them. Colin sat frozen in his leather chair, completely unable to speak or move. His entire luxurious life had just evaporated into thin air in less than 2 minutes. He had absolutely no commercial real estate deal. He had $0 in his frozen bank accounts. He had just successfully committed massive federal bank fraud by pledging a house he did not even own to a ruthless shadow lender. And the terrifying 24-hour deadline Silas had given him in the dark parking garage was rapidly bleeding away. The senior escrow agent closed his laptop with a loud, sharp snap. He looked at Colin with cold, professional disdain. The agent told Colin that he was legally obligated to report the massive funding discrepancy to the State Financial Regulatory Board. He asked Colin to pack his things and leave the premises immediately. Colin slowly stood up, his legs shaking so badly they could barely support his body weight. He blindly reached out and grabbed his gold pen, tossing it carelessly into his briefcase. He stumbled out of the executive boardroom and walked heavily down the long, carpeted hallway. He felt completely numb. He pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors and stepped out onto the busy downtown sidewalk. The bright afternoon sun blinded him. He looked desperately up and down the crowded street. He saw a sleek black vehicle parked illegally near the corner directly across from his own luxury sedan. Two large men in immaculate dark suits were leaning against the hood, watching him with cold, dead eyes. Silas and his debt collectors had arrived exactly as they promised. The absolute crushing weight of his total destruction finally fell upon Colin's shoulders, and he realized with terrifying clarity that there was absolutely nowhere left to run. I watched the security camera feed from the dark corner of my living room. I sat perfectly still in my heavy armchair, enveloped in complete shadows. The house was entirely silent, but I knew a massive storm was rapidly approaching my front door. Colin had somehow managed to evade the two professional debt collectors waiting outside his downtown office building. He had likely slipped out through a basement service elevator and sprinted through a dirty back alley like a hunted animal. He had driven frantically back to his luxury apartment just long enough to grab Megan and flee before Silas and his violent men could break down their front door. They had absolutely nowhere else to run. They had burned every single bridge and exhausted every possible line of credit. The only place left for them to go was the one place they thought still held tangible physical wealth. They were coming to rob the very house they had just failed to steal. The bright headlights of Colin's luxury sedan abruptly cut through the darkness of my front lawn. He did not park normally in the paved driveway. He drove his car aggressively up over the concrete curb, parking directly on the grass behind the large oak tree. He was trying desperately to hide the vehicle from the main street. The heavy car doors slammed shut with loud, echoing thuds. Through the thick glass of the front living room window, I watched my son and his wife sprinting across the damp lawn. They were completely unhinged. Megan was crying hysterically, tripping over her expensive designer shoes in the wet grass. Colin was dragging her roughly by the arm, his face twisted into a mask of pure feral panic. They reached the wooden front porch, panting heavily. Colin did not even try to search his pockets for his spare key. His hands were shaking so violently, he simply grabbed the heavy brass handle and threw his entire shoulder against the solid oak door. The door opened instantly. I had intentionally left it unlocked for them. They stumbled violently into the dark hallway, completely losing their physical balance. Colin caught himself against the painted wall, gasping for air like a drowning man. Megan collapsed onto her knees on the polished hardwood floor, sobbing uncontrollably. She begged Colin to tell her what they were going to do. She screamed that Silas was going to find them and kill them both tonight. Colin harshly told her to shut up and get off the floor. He ordered her to go straight into the kitchen and grab any silver serving pieces she could find. He said they needed absolutely anything they could melt down or pawn immediately for fast cash. He said he was going to head straight upstairs to the master bedroom. He told Megan he knew exactly where his mother kept her heavy diamond jewelry and her antique gold necklaces. He also mentioned my heavy steel wall safe hidden behind the large oil painting in my study. He bragged breathlessly that he had secretly watched me punch in the 4-digit access code many years ago. He genuinely believed that grabbing a handful of old diamonds and whatever emergency cash I kept in the safe would be enough to buy them a one-way plane ticket out of the country. He believed he could just pillage our family home and disappear into the night, leaving his mother fighting for her life in a sterile hospital bed while he ran away from the violent consequences of his own debts. I remained entirely motionless in the dark living room, listening to the chaotic, heavy footsteps thundering up the wooden staircase. The absolute blatant disrespect for our home was physically sickening. I heard Colin violently kick open the door to the master bedroom. I heard the loud crashing sounds of heavy wooden dresser drawers being pulled out and thrown aggressively onto the floorboards. I heard the frantic tearing of fabric as he ripped through Patty's meticulously organized closet. He was destroying her sacred personal space, looking for her beautiful velvet jewelry boxes. He was acting exactly like a common street thug, completely devoid of any basic human dignity or moral restraint. Down the hall, I heard Megan frantically tearing through the wooden kitchen cabinets. Glass plates shattered loudly against the granite countertops as she blindly searched for the heavy silver cutlery we only used for special family holidays. The beautiful warm home Patty and I had carefully built over 40 years was being violently ransacked by the very people we had spent our entire adult lives trying to protect and nurture. It was a tragic, pathetic display of absolute desperation. Upstairs, the frantic crashing noises suddenly stopped. A heavy, terrifying silence fell over the second floor. Then I heard Colin let out a loud guttural scream of pure, agonizing frustration. I knew exactly what he had just found. He had ripped the large landscape painting off the wall in my study, exposing the heavy steel door of the hidden safe. He had desperately punched in the 4-digit security code he had memorized so many years ago. He had pulled the heavy metal lever expecting to find thick stacks of emergency cash and highly valuable bearer bonds, but the safe was completely empty. I had removed every single valuable item from this house hours ago with the explicit help of Stephen Palmer. The antique gold necklaces, the heavy diamond rings, and the emergency cash reserves were all sitting securely inside an impenetrable bank vault across town. The velvet jewelry boxes in Patty's closet were entirely bare. There was absolutely nothing of monetary value left in this house for them to steal. I heard heavy, chaotic footsteps rushing back down the wooden staircase. Colin took the stairs 2 at a time, his breathing loud and incredibly ragged. He rushed back into the main hallway, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. Megan ran out of the kitchen holding nothing but a single silver serving spoon, her hands shaking violently. She looked at Colin with wide, terrified eyes, asking him where the jewelry was. She asked him if he had the emergency money from the safe. Colin leaned heavily against the wooden banister, sliding slowly down until he was sitting on the bottom step. He stared blankly at the empty, dark hallway. He shook his head slowly, his eyes wide and completely hollow. He whispered that it was all gone. He told her the safe was entirely empty, and his mother's jewelry boxes had been completely cleaned out by someone else. The stark, horrifying reality finally crashed down upon them with the weight of a collapsing building. There was no secret stash of money. There was no hidden family jewelry to pawn. There was absolutely no escape from the violent debt collectors currently hunting them through the city streets. They sat there in the dark hallway, completely broken and entirely defeated by their own massive greed. They had absolutely nothing left to steal and nowhere left to run. It was the exact perfect moment for me to finally turn on the living room lights. I reached over and pushed the small brass button on the heavy reading lamp sitting next to my leather armchair. The sudden burst of warm yellow light flooded the dark living room and spilled rapidly out into the hallway. Colin and Megan flinched violently, throwing their hands up to shield their eyes from the sudden blinding brightness. They scrambled backward on the polished hardwood floor, slipping and sliding like frightened animals caught directly in the bright headlights of an oncoming truck. When their eyes finally adjusted to the sudden light, the sheer absolute terror that washed over their pale faces was something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. I was sitting completely still in my favorite armchair, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I was not the crying, confused old man they had carelessly left behind at the hospital. I was sitting tall and staring at them with eyes as cold and hard as solid concrete. I was not alone in the room. Stephen Palmer was standing quietly beside the heavy stone fireplace, holding his thick leather briefcase in his right hand. His face was a mask of pure professional disdain. Standing silently near the front door, blocking their only physical exit, was a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a dark plainclothes suit. A second, equally intimidating man was leaning casually against the archway leading into the kitchen. These were not private security guards. These were 2 senior detectives from the Major Crimes Division of the City Police Department. They had been standing completely motionless in the shadows for the last 20 minutes, listening to every single frantic, desperate word my son and his wife had screamed as they violently tore my house apart. Colin pushed himself up from the floor, his legs trembling so badly his knees were actually knocking together. His arrogant mind desperately tried to construct a plausible lie to explain why he had just violently kicked open the doors of his own childhood home and destroyed his mother's bedroom. He took a shaky step forward, trying to force a sickly, reassuring smile onto his sweaty face. "Dad," he stammered, his voice completely devoid of any real confidence. "What are you doing here in the dark? We came over because we needed to find Mom's important medical insurance documents." We were just looking for the paperwork to help pay for the hospital bills. I am so sorry about the mess, but we were just panicking about her health." I did not raise my voice. I did not move from my comfortable chair. I simply looked at the silver serving spoon, still clutched tightly in Megan's shaking hand. "You do not use a silver soup spoon to pay for medical bills, Colin," I said, my voice perfectly flat and entirely devoid of any paternal warmth. "You use a silver spoon to pawn for quick cash when violent debt collectors are hunting you through the city streets. You use antique diamond necklaces to buy a one-way plane ticket when you have just committed massive federal bank fraud and you have absolutely nowhere left to hide." Colin's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked at Stephen Palmer, and then he looked at the two large men blocking the exits. The absolute crushing reality of his situation finally pierced through his thick layer of desperate arrogance. He realized in that exact moment that I knew absolutely everything. He realized that I knew about the dangerous loan sharks, the failing commercial real estate deal, and the supposedly frozen bank accounts. He slowly looked back at me, his eyes wide with a horrifying new understanding. He finally realized that the bank error in the hospital cafeteria was never an automated mistake. He realized I had intentionally cut his financial throat and watched him bleed out. Megan began to sob loudly, dropping the silver spoon onto the floor. It hit the wood with a sharp metallic clatter that echoed loudly in the tense, silent room. She fell back onto her knees, completely broken by the overwhelming presence of the detectives. She looked at Colin, begging him to do something, begging him to fix the massive disaster he had dragged her into. But Colin could not do anything. He was completely stripped of his power, his stolen money, and his desperate lies. I looked at the son I had raised, the boy I had sacrificed my own youth to protect and provide for. I saw absolutely nothing of myself in him. I saw only a hollow, greedy shell of a man who was willing to physically destroy his own mother for a fleeting taste of artificial corporate status. Stephen Palmer stepped forward, opening his heavy leather briefcase and placing a thick stack of official legal documents onto my coffee table. He looked at Colin with cold, clinical precision. "Mr. Foster." Stephen said, his voice cutting sharply through Megan's loud sobbing. "You have had an incredibly busy 24 hours. You have attempted to violently steal $350,000 from your mother's private investment accounts. You have successfully forged a medical power of attorney document. And you have fraudulently pledged a property you do not even own to secure a commercial bridge loan from a highly dangerous shadow lender." Stephen tapped the thick stack of papers with his index finger. "We have the complete digital transaction history, the forged signature files, and the sworn affidavits from your corrupt public notary." The tall detective standing by the front door took a slow, deliberate step into the living room. The heavy silence in the house was now completely suffocating, pressing down on Colin with the weight of a collapsing bridge. Colin was backed into a corner of his own making, entirely surrounded by the inescapable legal and financial consequences of his violent greed. He looked at the floor, completely unable to meet my eyes. He was no longer a wealthy real estate developer or a powerful corporate executive. He was just a pathetic, desperate criminal, waiting for the heavy iron gates of justice to slam shut permanently around him. The trap I had so carefully engineered was now fully sprung, and there was absolutely nothing left for him to do but confess. I leaned forward in my armchair and picked up the first piece of paper from the thick stack Stephen had placed on the coffee table. I held it up so the bright living room light hit the stark black ink. "This is a printed transaction record from your mother's private investment account," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "It shows a highly unauthorized wire transfer of $350,000 initiated exactly 1 hour before the ambulance was called to this house. You thought you were so incredibly clever, Colin. You thought because you had temporary administrative access, you could just drain her life savings and buy your way into that midtown commercial real estate project. But you did not realize that I have a private wealth manager who monitors every single massive transaction. I made one single phone call from the hospital stairwell while you were drinking your expensive iced coffee. I completely froze the entire banking network. That is why your credit cards declined in the cafeteria. It was never an automated system error. It was me completely cutting off your oxygen supply. Colin stared at the piece of paper, his entire body shaking violently. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a massive cliff, feeling the ground crumbling rapidly beneath his feet. He could not tear his eyes away from the printed transaction record. It was the physical proof that his entire timeline was a massive, easily disproven lie. I placed the transaction record back onto the table and picked up the second document. This was the piece of paper that truly sealed his absolute destruction. This is a copy of the medical power of attorney you submitted to the private shadow lender late last night, I continued, my voice echoing sharply in the quiet room. You actually found a corrupt public notary willing to risk federal prison time just to stamp a forged document. You falsely declared me mentally incompetent, and you fluidly forged my signature on the bottom line. You did all of this to secure a massive $400,000 commercial bridge loan using this exact house as collateral. You genuinely believed you could steal the roof over my head to pay off the violent men you owe. Megan let out a sharp, pathetic whimper. She covered her face with her shaking hands, rocking back and forth on her knees. The reality of the federal forgery charge was washing over her. But you made one massive, catastrophic miscalculation, Colin, I said, leaning closer to him, resting my elbows on my knees. You assumed I was just a foolish retired engineer who did not understand complex financial laws. You assumed this house was just sitting here completely unprotected, waiting for you to steal its massive equity. You looked at the walls of your childhood home and you saw nothing but a giant pile of cash to fund your arrogant lifestyle. I looked directly into his terrified eyes and delivered the final crushing blow. I do not own this house, Colin. Your mother and I transferred the physical deed of this entire property into an irrevocable philanthropic trust fund over 5 years ago. Stephen Palmer is the sole legal custodian of that massive trust. Colin stopped breathing. His jaw went completely slack. The gears in his arrogant brain finally ground to a horrifying halt as he tried to process the sheer magnitude of his mistake. He looked at Stephen and then back at me, his mind refusing to accept the absolute impossibility of his situation. I explained the exact mechanics of the trap I had built for him in simple, slow words, so he could fully grasp the depth of his ruin. I told him that when his private lender submitted the title verification request this morning, Stephen did not block it. I told him I explicitly ordered Stephen to approve the fraudulent loan. I wanted the shadow lender to process your massive request, I said, watching the absolute despair wash over his pale face. But Stephen legally mandated that the massive incoming funds had to be routed directly into the charity escrow account. So when you received that glorious digital approval message on your phone today, the money was not actually going to your commercial holding company. The entire $400,000 was swallowed completely by the charity trust. I let that terrifying reality hang in the air for a long, silent moment. The two plainclothes detectives stood perfectly still, watching the psychological execution unfold with cold, professional interest. Do you understand what you have actually done today, Colin? I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. You successfully committed massive federal bank fraud. You intentionally pledged a property you do not legally own to secure a commercial loan from highly dangerous people. The shadow lender legally released the funds, so you now owe them $400,000 plus their exorbitant weekly interest rates. But because the money went straight into my untouchable charity trust, you have absolutely $0 to show for your massive criminal effort. You walked into your commercial real estate closing today with nothing but empty pockets and a pocket full of federal crimes. You are entirely broke. You are massively in debt to violent loan sharks. And you are standing in a room with two senior police detectives who have a complete legal paper trail of your entire fraudulent existence. Colin fell forward, catching himself on his hands and knees. He looked like a physical puppet whose strings had just been violently cut. He stared down at the polished hardwood floor, panting heavily. The illusion of his powerful, wealthy life was completely shattered into a million tiny, unrecoverable pieces. He was not a corporate titan. He was not a real estate mogul. He was just a terrified, desperate little boy who had tried to steal from his own parents and had completely destroyed himself in the process. His breathing became incredibly shallow and rapid, a severe panic attack seizing his entire body. Megan grabbed Colin's arm, shaking him violently. She was completely hysterical now. Her voice was a high-pitched screech of pure, unfiltered terror. "Tell them it is a lie, Colin." She screamed, her face red and covered in frantic tears. "Tell them we can fix it. Silas is going to find us. He is going to kill us both tonight. You have to give the money back to the lender. You have to cancel the loan right now. You have to make them reverse the wire transfer, Colin." Stephen Palmer stepped forward, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the wood floor. He looked down at Megan with absolute professional disgust. "You cannot cancel a fully processed shadow loan, Mrs. Foster," Stephen said, his voice cold and precise. "The money is legally locked inside a charitable foundation. It is completely untouchable. Your husband has successfully defrauded a federal banking institution and a private lending syndicate simultaneously. There is absolutely no legal mechanism to reverse this transaction. The money is gone and the massive violent debt is permanently yours. You have stolen from men who do not forgive, and you have absolutely nothing left to offer them." I sat back in my comfortable armchair, completely satisfied with the total structural collapse of their lives. I had methodically stripped away every single layer of their false security. I had taken away their stolen money. I had taken away their fraudulent loan. I had taken away their commercial real estate dream. I had taken away their absolute freedom. They had walked into my home expecting to find a weak, vulnerable target, and instead, they had walked directly into a perfectly engineered financial meat grinder. They had absolutely nothing left. But the financial destruction was only the first part of my final equation. The money was simply the necessary bait to force them into a desperate corner. I wanted them completely starved of resources and terrified of the violent men waiting for them outside. The real crime, the absolute unforgivable betrayal, still needed to be addressed. I looked down at the floorboards near the heavy stone fireplace where the dark stains of my wife's blood were still hidden deep within the porous rock. I knew the intense pressure of complete financial ruin would finally break the last remaining bond between them. I knew one of them was about to crack under the massive, terrifying weight of the truth. The detectives waited patiently in the shadows, knowing the interrogation was already over and the final confession was imminent. The living room was completely silent, except for the ragged sound of Colin gasping for air on the hardwood floor. He was physically breaking down right in front of me. The realization that he was entirely broke and actively hunted by violent men had completely destroyed his nervous system. Megan was still clutching his arm, shaking him, and begging him to fix the impossible disaster. I watched them tear each other apart without having to lift a single finger. But the financial execution was only the foundation of my plan. It was time to bring the entire structure crashing down upon them. I stood up slowly from my comfortable armchair. My joints ached slightly, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. I walked around the edge of the heavy wooden coffee table and stood directly over my trembling son. I told him to look at me. I ordered him to raise his head and look his father directly in the eyes. Colin slowly lifted his pale, sweaty face. His eyes were completely vacant, devoid of any of the arrogant pride he had carried into this house. I pointed a steady finger toward the rough stone fireplace across the room. I told him that I did not spend my entire life building strong structures just to let a foolish, greedy boy tear them down. I explained that when I came home yesterday and smelled the harsh industrial bleach, I knew exactly what he had done. I told him about the ultraviolet diagnostic flashlight I kept in my basement workshop. I told him how I had swept the deep purple beam across the floorboards. I explained how the wood had glowed a bright manic blue from the chemical residue, and how the deep porous stone of the fireplace hearth had swallowed the purple light completely. I told him that I saw the dark, thick stain of human blood hidden deep inside the rock, where his frantic scrubbing could never reach it. Megan stopped shaking the arm of her husband. She froze completely, her eyes darting frantically between my face and the stone fireplace. Her breathing became incredibly shallow. She realized that the massive financial fraud was no longer their biggest problem. I looked directly down at her. I told her that the federal government was going to seize every single asset they possessed to pay back the fraudulent loan. I told her that Silas and his professional debt collectors were probably parking their dark vehicles at the end of our street right this very second. And I told her that when the police formally charged them with the attempted murder of my wife, the state prosecutor was going to ask for the absolute maximum prison sentence for both of them. I let the word both echo loudly in the quiet room. I said that the law rarely showed mercy to greedy, violent people, but sometimes the first person to speak the truth received a slightly smaller jail cell. I planted the seed of deep betrayal directly into her terrified mind. I knew her survival instinct was infinitely stronger than her marital loyalty. The silence stretched tight like a heavy steel cable ready to snap. Colin weakly reached out and grabbed the hand of his wife. He whispered her name, begging her to stay quiet. He told her I had no physical proof and that I was just an old man trying to scare them. But his voice was pathetic and entirely hollow. Megan looked at his trembling hand, and then she looked at the dark, terrifying shadows near the front door, where the two silent men were standing. The immense crushing weight of the federal prison sentence, the violent loan sharks, and the absolute financial ruin finally broke her mind completely. She violently ripped her hand away from his grasp. She pushed herself away from him, crawling backward across the polished floorboards like he was a highly dangerous disease. She pointed a shaking finger directly at his chest. Her voice erupted into a loud, hysterical scream that shattered the quiet atmosphere of the house. She screamed that it was all his fault. She said she never wanted to hurt anyone and that she was just following his terrifying orders. She confessed everything in a manic, breathless rush of horrifying words. She told the room that Patty had discovered the unauthorized bank transfer on her digital tablet and had threatened to call the police immediately. She screamed that Colin went completely insane when his mother firmly refused to let him steal the money for his commercial real estate deal. Megan cried heavily, stating that Colin grabbed the heavy brass poker from the metal stand. She said he swung it wildly and pushed his own mother with massive, brutal physical force. She described the horrible, sickening sound of the head of my wife striking the sharp, jagged edge of the stone hearth. She screamed that Patty fell to the floor, completely unresponsive and bleeding heavily onto the wood. Megan sobbed uncontrollably, confessing that Colin had forced her to run to the kitchen and grab the industrial bleach from beneath the sink. She said he threatened to leave her alone to face the violent loan sharks if she did not help him scrub the wooden floors clean before they called the emergency ambulance. She wept loudly, saying they had scrubbed the floor for a full hour, while Patty lay completely still, bleeding in the center of the room. She said Colin had meticulously planned the entire fake story about the loose Persian carpet to hide his violent crime. Colin collapsed entirely, burying his face directly into the hardwood floor. He let out a long, agonizing wail of total, absolute defeat. The absolute truth was out in the open air, and there was absolutely no way to pull it back into the darkness. I looked at Stephen Palmer and nodded slowly. The financial trap had successfully starved the rats, and the psychological pressure had finally forced them into the bright light of justice. Stephen stepped back, turning his attention toward the front hallway. The two tall men in plainclothes stepped slowly out of the shadows. They walked purposefully into the center of the bright living room, their heavy shoes thudding against the floor. The lead detective reached into his dark jacket pocket and pulled out a pair of heavy silver handcuffs. The sharp, metallic clinking sound was the most beautiful music I had heard in many days. The two detectives had been standing in my hallway for nearly an hour, waiting patiently for the absolute probable cause required to make a legal physical arrest. The hysterical, detailed confession was the final, absolute piece of the puzzle. The lead detective reached down and grabbed Colin firmly by the back of his expensive tailored jacket. He hauled my son up from the hardwood floor with effortless physical strength. Colin hung limp in the grip of the officer like a completely broken doll. The detective looked directly into the vacant eyes of my son and recited his legal rights in a cold, professional tone. He stated that Colin had the right to remain silent and that everything he had just done and said would be used against him in a court of law. He stated that Colin was officially under arrest for felony bank fraud, massive financial forgery, and the attempted murder of Patricia Foster. The second detective stepped over to Megan and pulled her roughly to her feet. He pulled her arms behind her back and placed her wrists in heavy iron cuffs as well. She continued to sob hysterically, her tears ruining her expensive makeup, begging the detectives to believe that she was just an innocent victim of her violent husband. I stood in the center of my living room and watched the two police officers drag my son and his wife toward the front door. Colin did not fight back. He dragged his feet across the floor completely empty and entirely ruined. I thought about my 40 years working as a civil engineer. I had spent my entire life learning that a structure built on a corrupted, weak foundation will inevitably collapse under its own weight. Colin had built his entire adult life on a foundation of massive greed, entitlement, and violent lies. He had gambled the life of his own mother for a taste of artificial corporate power, and he had lost absolutely everything. The financial strip down was entirely complete, and the physical execution had officially concluded. They were walking out of my front door to face decades in a concrete federal prison cell, and they would never set foot inside my home ever again. Silas and the violent debt collectors would strip away whatever physical property they had left, and the federal government would take away the rest of their natural lives. The heavy oak front door closed firmly behind them, shutting out the chaos of the night. The house suddenly felt incredibly clean and perfectly quiet. I turned to Stephen Palmer and thanked him for his flawless legal execution. The storm was finally over, and it was time for me to return to the hospital to sit beside my wife. The heavy steel handcuffs locked around Colin's wrists with a sharp metallic finality that seemed to echo through the entire house. The lead detective kept a firm, unyielding grip on the back of Colin's expensive, tailored collar, physically holding him upright. Colin's legs had completely given out underneath him. He dragged his expensive leather shoes across the polished hardwood floor, leaving dull scuff marks on the very wood he had tried to scrub clean of his mother's blood. He did not say a single word. His chin rested heavily on his chest, and his eyes stared blankly at nothing. He looked entirely hollowed out, like a building that had been completely gutted from the inside. Megan, on the other hand, was fighting a losing, desperate battle against the second detective. She was twisting her shoulders and kicking her designer heels frantically, trying to break free from the iron grip, holding her arms firmly behind her back. She was crying so hard that she was choking on her own breath. She pleaded with the detective, telling him she was a respectable business owner and that she could not possibly be seen in handcuffs. The detective ignored her pathetic cries entirely, pushing her firmly forward toward the dark hallway. I stood quietly by the stone fireplace and watched them take the long, terrifying walk toward the front door. This was the house Colin had grown up in. These were the walls that had protected him and the floors he had played on as a young child. He had walked through these rooms thousands of times, feeling entitled to absolutely everything inside them. Now he was being forcibly marched out of his childhood home as a violent criminal. The lead detective reached out and pulled the heavy oak front door wide open. The cool night air rushed into the stifling living room, bringing a sudden sharp clarity to the atmosphere. Outside on the quiet suburban street, The flashing red and blue lights of 3 marked police cruisers painted the manicured lawns in harsh, alternating colors. 2 uniformed patrol officers were waiting on the front porch, standing tall and imposing in the dark. The entire neighborhood was waking up. I could see the silhouettes of my neighbors standing on their front porches, watching the wealthy, arrogant real estate developer and his manicured wife being dragged across the wet grass in total disgrace. The absolute humiliation was entirely complete. Silas and the violent debt collectors might have broken Colin's physical body, but the flashing police lights and the staring neighbors completely broke his false pride. Before the detective pushed Colin down the front brick steps, my son stopped and turned his head slowly to look back at me. I stepped out of the shadows of the living room and stood squarely in the doorway, bathed in the pale yellow porch light. Colin looked at my face, searching desperately for a single ounce of paternal sympathy. He was looking for the father who had always bailed him out of trouble when he was a foolish, arrogant teenager. He was hoping to see a soft, grieving old man who might eventually forgive him and pay for a highly expensive defense lawyer. I gave him absolutely nothing. I stood there with my back straight and my expression completely turned to stone. I looked at him not as a father looking at a son, but as an engineer looking at a piece of completely defective material that had to be permanently discarded. He saw the cold, absolute finality in my eyes, and a fresh wave of tears finally spilled down his pale cheeks. He turned his head away and let the detectives drag him down the steps and across the damp lawn toward the waiting patrol cars. The uniformed officers took custody of Megan, forcefully guiding her head down as they shoved her into the hard plastic back seat of the second police cruiser. She kicked the door frame once before the heavy metal door slammed shut, trapping her completely in the dark. Colin was placed into the lead car, his head resting heavily against the reinforced glass window. The engines roared to life, breaking the quiet peace of the suburban street. The cruisers pulled away from the curb, driving slowly down the road until the flashing lights disappeared completely around the corner. I stood on the porch for a long time, listening to the fading sound of the police sirens. The toxic, chaotic energy they had brought into my life was finally gone. I turned around and walked back inside the house, quietly closing the heavy oak door and locking it firmly behind me. I walked into the living room and turned off the reading lamp, plunging the empty space back into a peaceful, quiet darkness. It was time for me to go back to the hospital. I drove back through the quiet city streets, feeling lighter than I had felt in days. The crushing weight of the last 24 hours had completely vanished from my shoulders. I was no longer a general commanding a battlefield. I was just a husband returning to the woman he loved. I parked my truck in the hospital garage, passing the exact dark corner where my son had faced his violent reckoning just a few hours earlier. The concrete walls held no terror for me now. The predators had all been caged. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the main lobby and took the elevator up to the intensive care unit on the 3rd floor. The sterile white corridors were perfectly silent in the early hours of the morning. The harsh smell of rubbing alcohol and antiseptic did not make my stomach turn anymore. It just smelled like a place of healing. I quietly pushed open the heavy wooden door to room 312. The room was bathed in the soft blue light of the medical monitors. I walked over to the stiff plastic chair beside the bed and sat down gently, taking Patty's cold hand in mine. For the first time since I found her, I did not have to split my attention. I did not have to calculate legal maneuvers or anticipate violent retaliation. I could just sit there and pour every ounce of my love and energy into her recovery. About an hour later, the lead neurologist walked into the room. He carried a digital tablet and wore a small, tired smile. He looked at the glowing monitors and then looked down at me. He delivered the exact news I had been praying for. He said the severe swelling inside her brain had completely stopped. The intracranial pressure had dropped back down into the normal safe zone. The absolute worst of the medical crisis had successfully passed. He told me her body was incredibly resilient and that it was time to let her breathe on her own. I stood back against the painted wall and watched as the medical team carefully removed the thick plastic ventilator tube from her throat. The loud mechanical hissing that had dominated the room finally stopped. It was replaced by the beautiful, quiet sound of my wife drawing a slow, natural breath. I sat back down in my chair and waited. I watched the morning sun slowly rise outside the hospital window, casting a warm golden glow across the white blanket. Her fingers twitched slightly against my palm. I leaned closer to her face, whispering her name over and over again. Her eyelids fluttered, fighting against the heavy sedatives. Slowly and painfully, she opened her eyes. They were unfocused at first, staring blankly at the ceiling. Then she turned her head slightly, and her beautiful eyes found my face. A tear slipped down my wrinkled cheek and landed softly on the bedsheets. She tried to swallow, but her throat was incredibly dry from the medical tubes. I quickly reached over and poured a small cup of fresh water, holding a tiny sponge to her lips so she could drink. She let out a long, shaky sigh. The confusion in her eyes slowly gave way to memory. I could see the exact terrifying moment when she remembered what had happened in our living room. Her body tensed violently. Her heart monitor began to beep with a sudden frantic rhythm. She gripped my hand with surprising strength, her eyes widening with absolute terror. "Colin," she whispered, her voice harsh and raspy. "The money, Calvin. He wanted the money. He had the fireplace poker." I gently placed my other hand over hers, stopping her frantic trembling. I leaned down and kissed her bandaged forehead, resting my face against her warm skin. "I am right here, Patty," I said, my voice thick with emotion, but completely steady and calm. "I am right here, and you are perfectly safe. No one is ever going to hurt you again." She looked at me desperately, searching my face for the truth. "He tried to force me to sign the transfer." She cried softly, tears welling up in her eyes. I told him no. I told him that money was for the charity. He was so angry, Calvin. He looked like a stranger. He pushed me. Did he get the money? Did he take our savings? I stroked her gray hair, gently soothing her racing mind. "He did not get a single penny, my love," I whispered. "I promised you I would always protect our family, and I kept that promise." I explained to her in very simple, gentle terms that I had discovered the truth the moment I came home. I told her I had immediately locked every single financial account and completely blocked his access to our wealth. I did not tell her about the violent loan sharks or the forged power of attorney. She did not need to carry the ugly burden of those dark details right now. She only needed to know that the threat was completely neutralized. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of profound grief and lingering fear. "Where are Colin and Megan?" I looked deep into her eyes, making sure she understood the absolute finality of my words. "I surgically removed the parasites from our lives, Patty," I said firmly. "They are gone. They are currently sitting in a federal holding cell, facing maximum prison sentences for what they did to you and what they tried to do to us. They will never step foot inside our home again. They will never ask us for another dollar. The toxic poison has been completely drained from our family tree." Patty stared at me, for a long time absorbing the massive weight of the truth. She mourned the final loss of her only son in that quiet hospital room, but I also saw a profound physical relief wash over her tired body. The years of endless manipulation, the constant disrespectful demands for money, and the terrifying violence were finally over. She did not have to be afraid in her own home anymore. She let out a long, trembling breath and closed her eyes, squeezing my hand tightly. "We are safe," she whispered, letting the tears fall freely onto her pillow. "We are absolutely safe," I replied, kissing her hand. The medical monitors slowed down, returning to a steady, peaceful rhythm. The bright morning sun filled the hospital room, washing away the last remaining shadows of the terrible night. I sat beside her, listening to her natural breathing, knowing that the hardest battle was over and the rest of our lives truly belonged to us again. 6 months passed with the slow, steady rhythm of a healing tide. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse felt entirely different than the front door of my home. Today, they were the gates of absolute justice. I sat in the front row of the quiet courtroom, holding Patty's hand. She looked beautiful, wearing a simple blue dress with a silk scarf carefully draped around her neck to cover the fading surgical scar. Her recovery had been a long, difficult journey, filled with intense physical therapy and quiet moments of reflection. But she had fought her way back to me with an incredible quiet strength. We did not look like vulnerable victims anymore. We looked like resilient survivors who had successfully weathered a massive, terrifying storm. Across the wide aisle, sitting at the heavy wooden defense table, were Colin and Megan. They were dressed in dull, oversized orange prison jumpsuits. The luxury tailoring, the expensive designer shoes, and the perfectly styled haircuts were completely gone. They looked incredibly small, pale, and entirely defeated. The federal judge struck his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block. The loud, sharp noise echoed through the high ceiling of the courtroom, bringing an absolute final silence to the room. The judge did not show them a single ounce of judicial mercy. He looked down from his high elevated bench and delivered a scathing reprimand. He spoke about the sickening nature of their greed and the fundamental, disgusting betrayal of sacred family trust. He formally sentenced Colin to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The combined charges of massive federal bank fraud and the attempted murder of his own mother carried a terrifyingly heavy toll. Megan received a strict sentence of 8 years for her active participation in the financial fraud and her desperate, calculating attempt to cover up the violent physical assault. Megan began to weep quietly, burying her pale face in her shackled hands. Her tears were entirely real now, born of absolute despair rather than manipulation. Colin did not move a single muscle. He stared blankly ahead, completely broken by the massive weight of his own irreversible actions. I watched the armed bailiffs physically escort them out of the courtroom through the heavy side door. I did not feel a single ounce of paternal pity. I only felt a profound, absolute peace, knowing the protective wall around my wife was finally completely impenetrable. We walked out of the cold federal courthouse and stepped directly into the bright, warm afternoon sun. The air smelled fresh and entirely clean. We drove back to our quiet suburban home, taking the long, scenic route along the beautiful coast. The house looked exactly as it always had, but the energy inside the walls was completely different. It was no longer a hidden target for greedy predators. It was a true, permanent sanctuary. We walked into the bright kitchen where Stephen Palmer was already waiting for us. He had a thick stack of official legal documents arranged neatly on the granite countertop. Stephen smiled warmly, pouring 3 cups of fresh coffee as we sat down at the table. He slid the top document across the smooth stone surface. It was the final legal authorization to formally transfer the recovered $350,000. The massive sum of money had been successfully extracted from the frozen accounts and entirely cleared of any lingering fraudulent attachments by the federal investigators. Patty picked up her reading glasses and a simple black ink pen. She looked at the paper, and then she looked at me, her eyes shining with absolute clarity and purpose. She did not hesitate for a single second. She signed her name fluidly on the bottom line, permanently donating the entire massive sum to a national foundation dedicated to protecting elderly citizens from domestic, financial, and physical abuse. She pushed the paper back to Stephen with a bright, beautiful smile. The violent greed that had almost destroyed our lives had been completely neutralized and transformed into a powerful financial shield for others who could not fight back. The legal execution was entirely finished, and the heavy ledgers of our lives were finally perfectly balanced. The wooden floorboards of my back porch are completely silent now. I sit in my rocking chair, watching the sun slowly dip below the tree line, painting the evening sky in deep shades of purple and gold. The air is cool and smells faintly of blooming jasmine from the garden my wife planted so many years ago. Inside the house, Patty is resting comfortably in her favorite armchair, reading a book with a soft blanket draped over her lap. The absolute peace that surrounds us right now is not an accident. It is a structure I carefully engineered and fiercely defended. I look out over the manicured lawn, and I think about the profound arrogance of youth. The younger generation often believes that power must be incredibly loud to be real. They believe power is defined by expensive, tailored suits, screaming on mobile phones, and driving luxury cars they cannot actually afford. They look at a quiet, elderly man drinking his morning coffee, and they see nothing but weakness. They mistake a slow physical gait for a slow mind. They mistake a lifetime of patient endurance for complete vulnerability. Colin and Megan made the ultimate fatal mistake of believing they were the smartest people in the room simply because they were the loudest. They genuinely thought they could just barge into our lives violently, take whatever they wanted, and leave us broken in the dirt. But they failed to understand the most fundamental law of nature. The most dangerous force in the world does not scream before it strikes. True power is absolutely silent. It is the deep, quiet foundation that holds up the entire building. It is the meticulous, invisible preparation that happens entirely in the shadows. I did not have to raise my voice to destroy my son. I did not have to throw a single physical punch to shatter his entire world. I simply stepped aside and allowed the immense crushing weight of his own massive greed to collapse directly on top of him. When you build your entire life on a foundation of lies and entitlement, you are constantly waiting for the ground to open up and swallow you. Colin authored his own absolute destruction the very second he decided that his mother was an obstacle to his wealth rather than a human being worthy of respect. He handed me the exact tools I needed to dismantle him piece by piece. Now he will spend the next 15 years locked inside a concrete cell with nothing but his own devastating regrets to keep him company. He will have plenty of time to learn the lesson he refused to learn in my house. Those who underestimate the quiet endurance of the old will inevitably be crushed by it. I take a slow, deep breath of the cool evening air. The game is permanently over. The predators have been completely eradicated from our garden. I gently push my feet against the wooden floorboards, rocking my chair slowly back and forth, listening to the beautiful, magnificent sound of absolute silence. The greatest lesson hidden within the wreckage of my son's life is that true power never needs to announce its presence. Society often conditions us to fear the loudest voice in the room, the aggressive demands of the entitled, and the flashy displays of artificial wealth. But genuine strength lies in absolute patience and the quiet observation of human nature. When you mistake a person's silence for ignorance or their kindness for weakness, you hand them the very weapons they need to dismantle your life. Greed always blinds the foolish, making them build their heavy castles on fragile sand, while the wise simply wait for the inevitable tide to come in and wash their arrogance away forever. If you believe that ruthless greed should always be met with cold, calculated justice, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences with toxic family members in the comments below.